In this video, we are going to be looking at the poem A Wife in London by Thomas Hardy. You'll find this poem in your poetry anthology, and you should become familiar with all of these poems as you approach your GCSEs. Now, in terms of the exam, on your literature paper 1, you will respond to 2 poetry anthology questions. A 15-mark question about a singular poem and a 25-mark question where you compare 2 poems. The poem we're looking at today is one that I suppose, thematically, we would consider to be a war poem. However, once again, it is not only a war poem. In the 2018 GCSE series, this poem was the given poem, and it was written, or the question was asked about how loss was presented. So make sure that you are thinking thematically broadly and not just, oh, there is only one theme within this poem. So, A Wife in London by Thomas Hardy, we're going to start with the title and think about, okay, so what is evident through the title of this poem? Me looking at that, A Wife in London. First of all, I think this woman is nameless. Does that mean this is applicable to more than one woman or more than one wife? How many wives are in London? My assumption will be if the wife is in London, the husband is somewhere else. What we're going to do is we're going to have a little look at some context. So think about the influence behind the writing, why Thomas Hardy wrote the poem, what is it essentially about before we read. So, there were 2 Boer Wars. One was in 1880 to 1881, and the second was in 1899 to 1902. And both of these wars were between the British and the settlers of Dutch origin in South Africa that put an end to the 2 independent republics that the settlers has founded. So the wars were over the huge gold reserves in South Africa. The British eventually had over 400,000 men in South Africa fighting for these gold reserves that they wanted. The Boers at their peak had 52,000, so at the most they had 52,000, and they were using boys as young as 9 to help them fight. In addition to that, the Boers were mostly untrained farmers fighting what was perhaps the greatest power in the world. So if you think about the size difference between these two, the match was very uneven from the beginning. The war eventually ended in May 1902 when the last of the Boers surrendered. 22,000 British troops and 25,000 Boer civilians had died in this conflict. Hardy wrote the poem in 1899 as the war was going on. He was heavily against the war, and his poetry presents war as pointless and destructive. So thinking about all those lives lost in this unfair battle for greed, for something to make people wealthy. If we think back to some other of the war poems we've looked at, so if you think about The Manhunt and Dulce, they both too have this idea that war is very destructive. It is something that has this lasting effect. If you think of Eddie Beddoes and his wife Laura and how this ongoing turmoil in their relationship is now still evident. If you think about Wilfred Owen and the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, it is good and honourable to die for your country. So we think about this very upfront idea that war is very destructive and pointless and painful in comparison to the soldier, which was more of the mind that it's really heroic and really noble and really patriotic. The poem is divided into 2 chapters, if you will, the tragedy and the irony. I'm just going to read through now. So, she sits in the tawny vapour that the Thames side lanes have uprolled, behind whose webby fold on fold like a waning taper the street lamp glimmers cold. A messenger's knock cracks smartly, flashed news in her hand of meaning it dazes to understand, though shaped so shortly. He has fallen in the far south land. 'Tis the morrow. The fog hangs thicker. The postman near and goes. A letter is brought whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker his hand, who the worm now knows. Fresh, firm, penned in highest feather, pageful of his hoped return, and of home-planned jaunts of break and burn in the summer weather, and of new love they would learn. So in the simplest essence, this poem in the first half, if you will, in the tragedy section of the poem, we find out that the wife who is in London, sitting in the tawny vapour, sort of this polluted area where she's sitting alongside candlelight, and outside it's cold and the street lamps on, she receives a telegram. So the messenger knocking smartly at her door, she receives a telegram to inform her that her husband has died in the far southland. So the far southland being South Africa, where he would have been fighting at war. So the gist of the tragedy section is a woman finding out that her husband has been killed. We then move on to the irony, so the second part of the poem, which is sort of the heartbreaking moment. The next day, so 'tis the morrow, the fog hangs thicker. So this representation, or this pathetic fallacy of, in the first half of the poem, it's cold outside, but there's sort of this glimmer. The next day, the fog is thicker, her mood has worsened, she has just received the worst news she possibly could. The postman nears and goes, so we have the return of the postman. A letter is brought to her. So the day after she receives the telegram telling her of her husband's death, she receives a letter from him, obviously written before his passing, talking about his hoped return and of days out in the summer weather and of this new love that they would learn together. So the irony being that by the time she receives this letter from him, he has already died. So the tragedy being the death, the irony being a day later, she receives this letter from her husband about this idea of the summer to come where they can be together. So obviously what we have here is this sort of the nature of how destructive war is. This wife in London sitting there waiting for her husband's return, him hopeful of his return, talking about times that they can spend together, only for this never sort of to come to fruition. He never makes it home. They never get to spend that time together. I think it's really interesting how this has been divided into two sort of chapters. It's not something you usually see within poetry, but I think it sort of highlights how sort of these 2 days are so close to each other. We have one day that is just a tragedy and the next day that's an irony, sort of like these chapters in her life, they've come so close together. She doesn't understand that he's died and that it's happened so quickly, and then the next day this letter, and it says penned in highest feather. So he spent time sitting down writing his hoped return and days out for them in the summer weather. It says here his hand, who the worm now knows, showing us that obviously he's now buried, he is no longer alive. If you look at this slide here, this shows you an example of what your GCSE paper may look like, and this is taken from the 2018 GCSE paper. So you get an hour, unless you get additional time, and that's a 20-40 split in terms of minutes. Your first question would say something along the lines of, read the poem A Wife in London by Thomas Hardy. In this poem, Hardy explores ideas about loss. Write about the ways in which Hardy presents loss in this poem, and you would spend 20 minutes responding to that question, writing about how Hardy presents this idea of a loss of relationship, a loss of time spent together, a loss of the life of this soldier, a loss of the husband to the woman. So thinking about these different ideas of loss within the poem and how Hardy presents them. For your secondary question, it says choose one other poem from the anthology in which the poet also writes about loss. Compare the presentation of loss in your chosen poem to the presentation of loss in A Wife in London. So here you need to be thinking back, because you won't have the poems in front of you, thinking back, so okay, what other poems do we see loss? Could I write about the manhunt and Eddie's sort of loss of a free mind, and Laura's loss of the husband she used to have? So here you want to be thinking about what other poems you can compare to and how you can go about comparing them.